I'm Jan Jacobs from the Commission Research Integrity of the Institute of Tropical Medicine. Today, we have a special message for you. On behalf of here at my side, Raffaella Ravinetto, who is the head here of the Institutional Review Board, and online we have Jerome Ahmed Singh from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban and from the University of Toronto. The reason why I invited them was because I read a very interesting paper written by both of my colleagues. It's about the dissemination of health and medical research, some guidance points. It's not about appropriate or correct dissemination, it is about responsible dissemination. It's a very interesting paper, and I thought maybe for a better digestion and a better retention, we can do an interview of both authors so that they can explain what is behind their paper. They will talk about abstracts, preprints, and press releases and the appropriate responsible way to deal with it. My first question is, do ethic guidelines and in scientific research integrity guidelines also apply on dissemination of research, or is it just about the conduct of research?
It's a very relevant question. Many researchers think of ethics guidelines as something to be applied when designing and conducting the research until it is ended, and we don't think of what happens afterwards. But in fact, main ethics guidelines, starting with the Helsinki Declaration, they are very clear that there are ethical obligations, for instance, to publish and disseminate each kind of research findings, whether they are positive, whether you like them, or whether they are negative, where if you don't like them, or if they are inconclusive, because all this helps to build a common knowledge and make science advance. Of course, in the past, it was kind of easier. Firstly, we disseminated our research findings within the scientific community, and only at a later stage then that could be disseminated to other people in the general public or politicians, policymakers. Today, the scenario is definitely a little bit more complex than that.
Thanks, Raffaella. I guess you talk about peer-reviewed publications for dissemination, or is there more?
Indeed, we always tend to think peer-reviewed publication in peer-reviewed journal, and this is seen by many people still today the kind of gold standard, even if these are not exempted from criticism, particularly after the first COVID-19 wave. There have been a lot of evidence that peer-reviewed journals have not been able to prevent publication of poor research, sometimes even of partly falsified data. So peer-reviewed publication remain the main way to share results within the scientific community, but you should really be careful that you do it according to the standards, to ethical standards, which are spelled out by different international organizations. And there are also responsibility from the journals. We all work in global health, and we know that the publication fee can be an obstacle, for instance, for researchers from low-income countries to publish. So there is also responsibilities from the journal to apply strict ethics requirements, and to have publication fees which are based kind of publication costs and not based on other factors like the reputation of a journal, for instance.
Maybe I'll also just add, Raffaella, that I think when you try, and this is a very important lesson, I think, for emerging researchers as well, is that there's a lot of pressure to publish in high impact publications. But I think, what's very important for everyone to remember is that there's a very high rejection rate in high impact publications. When I'm talking about that, I'm saying publications like the Lancet or New England Journal of Medicine in the English speaking world. And because of that very high rejection rate, you find that there's a lot of pressure on academics or new staff to have a scientific research record. So it then pushes them to look to lower ranked publications for some sort of output. And that's what we call predatory journals. We all get this in our inboxes, spammed every day, where we get approached by journals to publish. And most of them charge a publication fee. But I think the important lesson here is that even if they claim that they are peer reviewed, what is important to remember is that just because a publication or a journal claims to be a peer reviewed publication, it's not necessarily an indication of robust review or that the research is quality research, even if it's past peer review. Not all reviewers are equal in experience, in education, or in quality. And so you'll find that sometimes when poor quality reviewers are assigned to a publication, it may end up getting published and it seems to be in a peer review journal, but sometimes it can result in poor quality research being published under the guise of a peer reviewed publication. So I think, the important message is that not all peer review publications are high quality, even though peer review publications are seen as the benchmark to aspire to get, but just because something is peer reviewed doesn't necessarily mean that the publication is beyond any sort of reproach and that it's faultless.
Rafaela, one of my questions is when I'm thinking around abstracts which you send in for a congress, how to deal with this? Is this also peer reviewed or can I be a little bit more exploratory? What do you think?
Very interesting question, even particularly for young researchers. Getting an abstract accepted as a conference is kind of one of the first steps in the scientific community and the first ways where you practice to tell your peers what you're doing. And this is very important to do by knowing that some conferences are really demanding and competitive. So you may have good research which is not accepted as an abstract, but still it is good research. You have to be rather careful when you interpret other people's communication at conferences, because good conferences, they have a kind of peer review systems, and abstracts are assessed by peers for their validity. But we all know that abstracts may be of 300 to a maximum of 500 words. So a reviewer can assess the apparent quality, consistency, coherency, but will not be able to see how you made your calculation, will not be able to check versus source data. So it's still possible that an abstract is accepted, but there were flaws in the methodologies on the conclusion, and it cannot be assessed based on a half-page document. So as researchers, we have a responsibility, one, to try to publish as soon as possible what has been communicated as a conference so people can know the details and appreciate the quality of your research. And when you hear to somebody else, you have always to remind that this is an abstract, it's based on partial information, but to fully appreciate the quality of that findings, you have to wait for the full publication, or at least for the full preprints.
Okay, thanks, Rafaela. And a question for Jerome. We now discussed the abstracts, but frequently you send in a manuscript to a journal. At the same time, you publish it as what is called a preprint. What's all this about, this preprints? Is this good practice, or should we better don't do it? Jerome, what do you think?
I think preprints have an advantage in that they allow for quick publication in an open way. But essentially, what preprints are is a report of a work that you've done, research, but that's not yet peer reviewed. It gets uploaded usually in an open access server, And usually that means that anybody who's looking for that subject matter will be able to see the provisional findings of that paper. Now, they are advantageous in that they offer rapid open access dissemination. And also you get some people who even comment in the comment section. So you get a little bit of rapid feedback from your colleagues. But the main problem here is that these are not yet peer reviewed. So they're not considered robust research. And you'll find that essentially when the common media, the general mainstream media picks this up, very often they report on a preprint finding, but this can very often change later on. So they are advantageous. You know, during COVID-19, a lot of important papers were published on these types of servers, these open access servers. But the main challenge was that these were not considered to be final findings. And sometimes these findings changed when they were subject to robust peer review. And when you go through a peer review process, sometimes you can have up to 3 to 5 peer reviewers. And so you'll find that they push you a little bit and they ask you to provide more information, or they may find a fault with your findings. So you'll find that your preprint paper may in fact end up being quite different when it's published in a journal. So many journals now allow for your paper to be published on an open access server, a preprint server, in addition to being submitted to them concurrently, just in the interest of transparency and quick dissemination. But I think the important message here is that preprints should not be allowed to dictate policy, and they shouldn't become a basis for informing policy decisions, because that's not considered to be a final version of that paper. It's just a very early version of that paper that has not yet been subject to peer review.
Okay, thanks, Jerome, for this question, for this answer. Raphael and Jerome, is this all? I heard Jerome talking about the media are picking up media and scientific dissemination of scientific results. How does it go?
I can start by saying that indeed we have to think every time we are publishing something which may have some kind of resonance, either locally in Belgium or locally in the country of the research or internationally. We have to think how journalists could translate in a very shortened way our message, and we have to be very careful that our findings are not translated in a kind of a sensationalist way, where people will only see, for instance, the good part of the things and not side effects, not the unknown part. But what I would like Jerome to go through more in details, it's also something which is very specific when a corporate or maybe also a Global Health Institute decide to proactively make a press release to announce study result. I think that's becomes much more complex in terms of responsible conduct. Jerome, I think you're in the better position to explain these challenges.
I think, probably the best way to remember what we are talking about is when the first COVID-19 vaccine results were announced. These are very early results in November, December 2020, and Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca released their provisional results through press releases. And it left more questions than answers. It was very helpful to learn that there may in fact be some positive findings, but it left a lot of unopened questions. And I think this has become a more common practice even before COVID, but in the last few years, where major corporates of the pharmaceutical industry or biotech industry release their early results in a press release. And this is mainly to actually influence investor sentiment and also stock prices as well. I think we have to be not naive to assume that they are only doing this to disseminate research. And I think, typically what happens when different investigative reporters have looked at the issue and when this has been looked at critically is that these press releases are very often preceded by what we call buybacks. So you find the executives buy back their own stock before they announce the press release, which is typically positive results. And then when they buy back their own stock, there's less stock available for purchase by other people. Then they announce their press release, which will usually typically contain very positive findings. And as a result, their stock prices really rise because there's limited amount of stock available for purchase. And when they, in fact, then announce these results, generally it's very positive, but there's a lot of information that's missing. And I think more importantly for our purposes, it's important to remember that these press releases are often done by marketing experts, not necessarily by scientists. So they're done for, essentially in English would say, this was done with a very good spin. So, you put it in a very positive light, you generate some buzz, the stock market, your stock prices start to go up. But essentially you'll find that it is not something that is necessarily, of course, robust. And I think that the lesson here is that if scientists are involved in this research, it's incumbent on them to ensure that when they release, when these press releases are being issued, that they actually review these press releases to ensure that there's accurate information being disseminated, and that they also have a moral responsibility to ensure that whatever is being communicated by these media experts does actually reflect the science. So, this is something that is becoming more common. A lot of major biopharmaceutical sector players are now announcing major results by press release, and it creates big demand. It puts a lot of pressure on regulators to now approve this, but of course, it still has to be subject to peer review, and it still has to be subject to regulatory approval. But part of this is to generate the buzz and rise, get stock price rising, and to generate maybe a little bit of profit and buzz for them. So I think we just need to be aware of that this is a new form of dissemination, but it's not considered robust at all. And we have to look at this with, quite a critical eye when these press releases are announced.
And thanks, Jerome. I must confess there's a lot of information. We talk about abstracts, we talk about preprints, peer-reviewed journals, press releases, and so on. Many things, many guidelines. Is there a kind of way to summarize the best practices and the best conduct to do?
It's indeed complex, and I was also thinking some of our colleagues or students may think it's not us who's drafting the press release, so this is not our responsibility. And indeed, it is. You can be in the future a member of the study team of a big commercial studies, and so you will have in a position to approve or revise such a press release. But even from our own institution, we may have communication initiatives to communicate the results of our findings. And we may be tempted to say, we found something which is going to help to find out the solution for this disease. And this can be false, can give false hopes to patients. This can give false hopes to policymakers. So we always have to think as researchers, we have societal responsibilities. We have to present our data, but we have a responsibility to present the complexity of the research undertaking among us and to the public. And this more and more, 30 years ago, the only way for a researcher to talk to the society was to talk to a press, to be so lucky to raise the interest of a journalist. Now you can be active on your social media feeds, and people will not read them as the one of a lay person, but of a scientist. So we have all to get this responsibility. I am using integrity guidelines when writing my publication, but I have to think, I have a preprint. I must be very clear that this is not peer review yet. If my publication is not accepted, I was also to withdraw the reprint. So there are a number of behaviors that we should build in and really try to escape from this publish and perish or perish mentality, which is pushing us. It's very difficult to resist it, but we have to resist.
Okay, Jerome?
I think it's important to remember that, we must always be mindful that when science results, especially something that is, quite important, gets communicated, that it's going to eventually cascade its way down to the mainstream media, which has traditionally been for decades how science results have been communicated. But I think we also should remember now that there's social media. And in fact, you know, mainstream media has declined in recent years in prominence, and social media has really risen. And so everybody on social media thinks they're an expert, even if they're not. They have no science education, no formal education. People have the power of the tweet. And I think, you know, it's very important that if a scientist tweets something, that they make a responsible tweet, that they critically appraised the information that they are tweeting about, read it themselves, and that they're not reading a summary of somebody else's work and then tweeting it, because this is how you find something, and we use the word viral, something going viral, which is quite appropriate when we're looking at public health. But when, you know, social media message goes viral, it's very rapid dissemination of information, far faster than what mainstream media typically has been able to do. So I think it's quite important that when scientists look at disseminating research findings, either as a primary disseminator or as a secondary disseminator when they tweet or retweet findings, that they do so in a responsible manner. And I think it's also quite important, and this has become quite important in recent years, is that even the media, the mainstream media, have begun to realize that not just any reporter should be covering a science story. The science reporters should have some sort of information and some sort of critical eye for the information that they're carrying. So now you have science reporters who usually have a degree in that particular science who are then, you know, covering stuff. But I think we do need to remember that not all reporters have got a science background, and that anybody has got access to social media and can tweet something or can in fact retweet something. And that means really rapid dissemination. And if it's false information or misleading information or incomplete information, that can really damage the science before the final results are actually released. And I think we all need to be quite responsible in how we disseminate our information, especially science information.
Okay, thanks. I would like to conclude and try to summarize to the best what the expert just had explained and what you can read again in their paper, which we will send to you. Scientific dissemination or dissemination of scientific results is basically also part of the integral research integrity process. We know the option of the peer-reviewed journal, which is the standard option, which takes time, but which go to a really scrutinizing process of peer review. Other disseminations are, for instance, the abstract, but all of the different channels have their own audience, their own mechanism, but their own risk. The abstract is short, will tell part of what had happened, does not contain all the information, but also can get its own life. The preprint will be faster than the standard and the routine post service, but preprints, again, are missing the steps of the peer review, and you should especially take into account that it has not yet passed the peer review and consider it as such. Finally, the press release may be optimistic, may be too optimistic, and also may have other effects and maybe side effects which are related to premature communication or not entirely correct communication, shedding not enough light on the limitations, for instance, of the research. I would like to ask my colleagues and the experts, do you have something to add to this message?
I would say that we really need to kind of rebuild in our ethics or integrity behavior in relation to dissemination of our research finding. And this is also something very concrete. I was just thinking in the past that some, for instance, research on TB clusters. The way you disseminate the research outside the scientific circle can end up very harmful consequences for people. You can end up causing stigmatization of groups or communities. So there are so many different aspects where we always have to think am I communicating all what I found, also what I don't like, and am I doing in such a way that I think of how it would be used outside a scientific group. And that's really part of our societal responsibilities. As scientists, we are not only technical aspects, we are actors in the society with particular responsibilities to have in mind.
Jerome?
I think, I'll just summarize more or less what I said. I think, essentially, I think as scientists, we have a moral responsibility and a scientific responsibility to ensure that we understand the science that we are going to communicate and that we also do so in an accurate way. I think, self-interest is very important to many people, but I think when we're doing science, we're usually doing this for public benefit. And we need to understand that we have a moral responsibility to ensure that the science that we communicate and that the science that we share is in the best interest of everyone and not just self-interest. So I would say that scientists need to have a critical eye when they are looking at press releases, preprints, or even peer-reviewed publications, and when they're communicating their own science, that they do so in a fair and unbiased way. And remember that it's not about self-interest, but that the interest of the common good is much more important than self-interest.
Okay, thanks for these compliments. Thank you for listening. Thank also for Vera Kuhne, who has done the recording and the editing. And we will be with you for a next session about research integrity very soon. Have a nice day.